In a moonlit clearing, deep in an ancient forest, white-robed priests climb the sturdy boughs of a sacred tree. By the light of torches, a druid uses a golden sickle to cut down clusters of mistletoe, the mystical plant that the Gauls believe is sent from above. Below, the villagers gather around two snow-white bulls, awaiting a solemn sacrifice. It sounds like a scene from a fiction novel, but is rather drawn from eyewitness accounts of Gaulish ritual recorded by Romans. A vivid glimpse like this sets the stage for our journey today into the world of ancient Gaul, that land of fierce warriors, wise druids, and bustling hilltop towns. Rich traditions flourishing before and during the Roman conquest in the 1st century BC. And so allow me to welcome you to our time today as we talk about the culture of the ancient Gauls, the Celtic peoples who inhabited much of Western Europe, present-day France, Belgium, Western Germany, Northern Italy in antiquity. We are going to talk about the key aspects of their culture, religion, mythology, customs, and daily life. We'll also have a look at language and their learning institution, systems of government as they existed before and during the Roman conquest. But our understanding is not based in conjecture, but rather contemporary witnesses like Julius Caesar himself, who campaigned in Gaul and documented its society, and on the writings of Greeks such as Diodorus Siculus and Strabo. But these sources have a bit of a bias, so it must be cross-referenced with the swath of archaeological discoveries we have, from the remains of fortified towns to the hoards of weaponry and sacred offerings. It all helps complement the classical text. So how about you come with me back to those ancient times, and we can figure out what it was like in those days of ancient Gaul. But let me first issue a proper welcome to those joining us for the first time. If you've not yet hit the subscribe button, I encourage you to do so. It's right next to the like button, and little comments always help for the engagement. You know I have to say it. But thank you very much to those who help keep these videos ad-free by supporting on the Patreon and YouTube memberships, along with those who checked out the merch store. Lots of nice little goodies there. So, with all that out of the way in the most succinct fashion I can give to you, how about we get nice and relaxed, and let's begin our journey. So let's begin. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. The famous words of Julius Caesar at the outset of his commentaries of the Gallic War. Those parts were inhabited by the people that the Romans called the Aquitani, Belgae, and the Celts or Gauls proper. In a geographical sense, Gaul encompassed the vast territory covering most of modern France and Belgium, parts of Switzerland, the Netherlands, and even northern Italy. A patchwork of tribal regions, with shared cultural traits, but no single political unity. Each tribe, or in the Latin rendering civitas, had its own name and territory. The Arverni in the Massif Central, the Aedui in central Gaul, and the Sequani near the upper Rhine, the Helvetii in the Alpine Plateau, and the Senones and Parisi among dozens more. Now these tribes all varied in size and power. Some numbered in the hundreds of thousands of people, at least by ancient estimates, while others were much smaller. Despite local differences, they shared a broadly Celtic culture, at least in a blanket term sense. Now this includes language, art styles, and social organization, which had spread across Iron Age Europe. They were known to the Greeks as Keltoi or Galatai, and to the Romans as Galli. In physical terms, classical observers described the Gauls as tall and strong, with light skin and blonde hair. In fact, many Gauls lightened their hair artificially. It was custom to wash hair in lime water, spiking it up at the back so that it resembled the mane of a horse. Men often wore impressive mustaches that could grow long enough to cover the mouth, causing, as one source wryly notes, a warrior's drink to filter through his mustache and food to get caught in it during meals. These vivid details, recorded by Diodorus, give us a sense of the Gaul's appearance. You can certainly imagine it in your mind, intimidating and wild to Greek and Roman sensibilities, yet also, according to their own fashions, quite carefully groomed. Of course, appearance is from the neck down also. The Gaulish attire added to this striking appearance. The Gauls loved bright colors and rich fabrics. They wore shirts or tunics dyed and embroidered in diverse hues, and long trousers called brachae, a style unfamiliar to Mediterranean people, who typically wore knee-length garments without pants. Over these, they donned cloaks called sagum, often striped or plaid in pattern, fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. Cloaks varied in weight with the season. Heavy woolen wraps for winter cold, lighter ones for the summer. But both men and women adorned themselves with jewelry, especially massive torques, that is, rigid neck rings of solid gold or bronze, along with bracelets and rings. Gold was relatively abundant in Gaul's rivers and hills, so it wasn't a problem to collect it as dust from stream beds and have local craftsmen hammer it into different shapes. And as a result, even warriors sometimes wore golden corselets or belts, and noble chieftains displayed wealth and status through such ornaments. Gaulish tribes built settlements, ranging from small farming village to large fortified centers. By the 2nd and 1st century BC, many regions of Gaul had developed oppida, substantial towns located on hilltops or plateaus, fortified with ditches, earthen ramparts, and strong timber and stone walls. One famous example is Bebracht, that is Mount Beauvray in Burgundy, an oppidum of the Aedui, where Caesar himself spent a winter and was frankly astonished by its sophistication. The Gauls' engineering in fortifications was highly advanced. Their characteristic murus Gallicus, Gallic wall, construction consisted of a timber lattice framework filled with earth and stones, reinforced then with iron spikes. These ramparts were remarkably sturdy and also fire-resistant, as archaeological excavations have confirmed. Such walls allowed oppida like Avaricum or Gergovia to withstand Roman sieges for considerable time. During Caesar's assault on Avaricum in 52 BC, the Bituriges defenders and their allies used ingenious methods to counter the Romans, constructing extra tower stories on their walls, ensnaring Roman siege hooks with ropes, and digging mines to collapse the attacker's camp. Caesar grudgingly praised the Gauls as a, quote, most ingenious race. And clearly, Gallic society of this time was not just some static barbarian backwater. It was inventive, adaptable, capable of large-scale cooperation, but still fragmented into rival tribes. So let's look into society and government in the next section. Ancient Gaulish society was hierarchical. and very much clan-based, as we've seen from the tribal affiliations being very complex. Now, at the broadest level, each tribe or nation had its own ruling class of nobles, and often a single leader, being a king or a chief magistrate, although the exact form of governance varied by the tribe. According to Caesar, Gaul had two leading social orders of prestige: the nobility, especially the warrior aristocracy, whom he calls the equites. Think of it as like knights in our English rendering from the Latin. And then we also have the Druids, the learned priestly class, which I recently did a video on in great detail. We'll discuss it all briefly in this next section. Now, the common freemen, by contrast, had very little formal power. Caesar rather bluntly states that ordinary Gauls were treated almost as slaves by the powerful, often bound by debt or patronage to nobles, and not consulted in major decisions. Well, I suppose that's not too different from most ancient cultures. Are you really surprised? But this description may exaggerate the commoner's helplessness, at least coming from Caesar's patrician Roman perspective, but it does indicate a strong patron-client dynamic in Gaulish society. A wealthy noble typically had a large retinue of dependents bound to him by loyalty and obligation. In Gaulish terms, clients, and sworn solduri and ambacti, that is, household warriors, who served their lord in both war and peace. Governance at the tribal level ranged from monarchies to oligarchic councils. Some Gallic tribes were traditionally ruled by kings, while others by the 1st century BC had transitioned to electing annual magistrates. One example of this is the Aedui, longtime allies of Rome. They no longer had a hereditary king in Caesar's day, but instead elected a chief magistrate, known as the vergebret, every single year to hold civil authority. This official was even forbidden to leave Aeduan territory during his term, perhaps to prevent tyranny. As they say, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Nothing kicks off a rebellion more than the king leaving the homeland. I suppose it's a smart decision to lock him in. Strabo notes that in earlier times many Gallic communities chose one leader yearly to administer justice, and one war leader for military campaigns, an early form of republican rule. However, in crises like the Roman invasion, charismatic war chiefs could emerge. Of course, the most famous is the great Vercingetorix of the Arverni, who in 52 BC united numerous tribes in a grand, if ultimately doomed, rebellion. Vercingetorix was proclaimed king and general by a confederation of Gauls, desperate to coordinate the resistance against Caesar's armies. They have a great statue to Vercingetorix, which you've no doubt seen flashing through the images of this video at the start of the talk. And so Gaulish tribes also sometimes formed larger leagues. By Caesar's time, two great coalitions had emerged, one led by the Aedui, long favored by Rome, and another by the Sequani, who even invited Germanic tribes from beyond the Rhine to assist them. Caesar's arrival upset the balance. After his victories, Aeduan influence was restored, and their allies, the Remi, rose to second prominence. But this certainly shows how intertribal politics in Gaul could be very complex, with shifting alliances and occasional foreign intervention. One unique institution that bound Gallic society together was the Druidic order. The Druids were not merely priests, but also judges, teachers, and political advisors, providing a kind of social glue across tribal divisions. In fact, Caesar asserts that Druids held authority in almost all disputes, public and private. They arbitrated in crimes, land boundaries, inheritance, and could even stop battles by just showing up in the middle of the fray and negotiating peace. If an individual or community disobeyed a Druidic judgment, the punishment was severe: excommunication from sacrifice, meaning not that you get away with not being sacrificed, but more that you just don't get the benefits and the exclusion from all religious rites. Pretty scary for very closely held beliefs, and such persons were considered as impious outcasts, untouchables, legal justice denied to them, with all the community shunning them. Thus, without a centralized state, there was a sense of pan-Gallic law and moral order, and it was upheld by the Druids. At least once a year, according to Caesar, Druids from all over Gaul convened in the territory of the Canutes, near the geographic center of Gaul, to hold a great council and adjudicate inter-tribal affairs. Caesar even notes a tradition that Druidism originated in Britain, and that aspirants traveled to Britain for training. Well, whether or not that was 100% true, it certainly suggests that the Druids formed a network transcending individual tribes, a network the Roman conquerors later viewed as frankly dangerous, precisely because it could foster unity, and with unity comes resistance. But in terms of their own hierarchy, one Druid was recognized as the Archdruid, wielding the highest authority among them. Upon his death, the successor was chosen by either an acclamation of the Druids or, if contenders were equal, sometimes by armed contest. The Druids enjoyed major privileges in society. They were exempt from military service and all taxes, certainly making it an attractive vocation for many families. Gaulish parents sent their sons to study under the Druids, and the training was rigorous, involving memorization of vast amounts of knowledge. It is said that some Druidic students spent 20 years learning by heart countless verses of lore. Importantly, the Druids did not write any of this down. I know, disappointing, isn't it? Although they used Greek letters, though, for mundane matters like record-keeping, they committed all their religious and philosophical knowledge to memory alone. Lost to the pages of history, I'm afraid. Now, why would they do this? Well, why not ask Caesar for his point of view? After all, he was there, and he speculates that they did this partly to keep their wisdom exclusive to the initiated ones who had access to it, and also partly to strengthen the memory, not trusting written text as a crutch. And there's a bit of a logic to it. Why would anyone bother memorizing everything and being able to do everything by heart if they could just write it down and forget about it? I suppose there is that logic to it. Now, what about the doctrine? Well, it did include teaching that souls are immortal and transmigrate to a new body after death, a belief that cast out the fear of dying and in Caesar's view spurred great bravery in battle. They also engaged in learned discussions about the cosmos and nature. Quote, as Caesar recounts, the stars and their movements, the size of the universe and earth, the nature of things, and the power of the immortal gods. In other words, they were philosophers and astronomers, as well as theologians. Thanks to this influence, wisdom and law stood above blind force in Gallic values. Diodorus even claims that in earlier times Druids were so respected that they could halt two armies at the brink of battle by just stepping between them and commanding peace. Now, whether that's literally true or not, the anecdote highlights the ideal that rational counsel and spiritual authority trumped warrior rage in Gaulish society. Well, of course, if you want to hear that in even more detail and expand on some of those points, just go and watch the video about the Druids. We're not going to have this whole talk about the Druids. It's more about daily life and material culture now. So what exactly was it like to live in a Gallic community? Well, far from being simply barbaric times, the Gauls had a rich daily culture that impressed and sometimes shocked ancient observers. So let's look at their agriculture, their food, housing, and social customs, and all those other little aspects of daily life. In the countryside, many Gauls lived in extended family farmsteads or hamlets. A typical dwelling was wood and thatch, often circular or oval in plan, with walls of timbered posts interwoven with wattle and daub, that is, mud plaster. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds. Such houses archaeologists find were cozy and insulated, well suited to Gaul's temperate climate. In oppida and larger villages, houses might be rectangular with multiple rooms, workshops, and thatched roofs that rose high in dome shape. Strabo notes that Gallic houses were dome-like and large, built of planks and wickerwork, and heaped with thatch. These structures were solid and weatherproof, offering comfort in winter and cool shelter in summer. The landscape of Gaul was dotted with these farms, each surrounded by fields and pastures, and in certain strategic locations these farmsteads clustered to form proto-towns, of course, behind fortifications. There were also likely skilled farmers and herders. They cultivated grains, wheat, barley, oats, as well as legumes and vegetables. They had abundant livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, and especially pigs, which were allowed to forage in woodlands and grow fierce and large. Pork was their favorite meat. Diodorus remarks that the Gauls feasted on meat of all kinds, but especially enjoyed pork, both fresh and salted. Their swine were so fearsome that, quote, it is dangerous for an unfamiliar person to approach them. Cattle provided not only beef, but also dairy products, milk and cheese, which along with grains, fruits, and wild game helped to round out the Gallic diet. Meals were hearty and protein-rich by Mediterranean standards. The centerpiece was often boiled or roasted meat prepared with great iron cauldrons or on spits over the hearth. Heaps of animal bones found in Gaulish excavations, ranging from cattle and pig to deer and wild birds, attest to this frequent consumption. But no description of Gaulish daily life can omit their legendary love of wine. Grapevines did not grow well in most of Gaul, so wine was an imported luxury. By the 2nd century BC, Italian and Masoliite merchants were hauling large amphorae of wine into Gaul, and the thirst of the Celts seemed to be extraordinary. The Gauls drank wine unmixed with water, whereas the Romans always diluted theirs, and they drank it in great volume. They would guzzle it pure from jars and fall into stupor or frenzy, according to Diodorus. Many Italian traders, of course, became rich from this trade, reportedly exchanging 1 jar of wine for a slave. Such was the Gauls' eagerness for the drink. When imported wine was scarce or too costly, the Gauls brewed their own intoxicants, a barley beer called cervicia or zithos, and of course mead, fermented honey water. Even these they drank heartily. Classical writers often comment on the Celts' heavy drinking, a trait that, combined with their pride, could make feasts understandably rowdy. But the Gauls were famous for their lavish feasts in general, which had important social and political functions too. Chieftains would host great banquets to solidify alliances and reward their warriors. At these feasts, seating was traditionally on the ground, or on low benches covered with animal skins. Wolf or dog pelts are mentioned. Huge joints of meat, boiled in cauldrons, roasted over open fires, were brought out like trophies. Each diner carved off slices with their personal sword or knife. A special honor was given to the bravest warrior, the champion's portion, the choicest cut of meat, often a whole haunch or best loin, presented to that man in front of the assembly. And this could sometimes spark contention if multiple warriors felt deserving. Ancient sources recount that banter at Gaulish feasts could quickly escalate, fueled by all the strong drink mixed with the pride. A trivial dispute might lead warriors to challenge to each other in single combat right in the middle of dinner. Such duels, fought in front of the guests, were a way to settle honor on the spot. Despite this hot-bloodedness, the Gauls were also praised for their hospitality. They would invite strangers to join their table, and only afterwards inquire about their identity or needs. Feeding a guest was, to them, a sacred duty. This generous welcome extended even to enemies on occasion, an aspect of Celtic hospitality that Greco-Roman observers seem to admire. And what about family life and women? The Gauls lived in patriarchal, but by some accounts more gender-complementary communities than the Romans did. Women in Gaul could own property, and often managed farm work and household affairs, especially when the men were busy away at war. Ancient commentators suggest that Gaulish women had a greater public presence than their Mediterranean counterparts. Strabo makes a cryptic remark that among the Gauls, quote, the task of the men and women have been exchanged in a manner opposite to us. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, it likely means that women did some heavy labor, while men engaged in activities that Romans might consider women's work, though the exact interpretation is unclear. Perhaps it also hints at the notable role of women in spiritual life, as priestesses or seeresses. Indeed, Roman writers mention Gallic prophetesses and holy women, for example, a virgin priestess presiding over an oracle in the land of the Senones, or legends of Celtic sorceresses on certain Atlantic islands. As for Caesar's writings, well, he describes some startling domestic customs. He claims that Gaulish men had the power of life and death over their households, and that if a noble died under suspicious circumstance, his wives could even be tortured and executed. In earlier times, he adds, slaves and dependents beloved by the deceased would be burned along with him on the funeral pyre. Such reports might have been exaggerated propaganda, but they do suggest that funerary rites could be elaborate and occasionally brutal. This reflects the belief that a great chieftain should enter the afterlife accompanied by those and that which he loved in life. Caesar also noted that unlike Romans who counted by days, the Gauls counted by nights instead, measuring a fortnight as 14 nights instead of 14 days. This is one example. This likely reflects a belief in an underworld ancestry, as they claimed descendant from a god of the dark underworld, making night rather than day the fundamental unit of time. Additionally, a Gaulish custom dictated that children were kept apart from their fathers in public until coming of age. It was considered disgraceful for a warrior's son, while still a boy, to appear at assemblies or ride out with his father. And this taboo suggests a rite of passage. a young Gaul had to reach fighting age, perhaps his mid-teens, and prove himself in war before being acknowledged as a man worthy to stand beside his father socially. The Gauls of the late Iron Age were skilled metalworkers and artisans. They even were credited rather, with inventing chain-mail armor, later adopted by the Romans, who actually called it Gallic armor. They manufactured high-quality iron weapons, including long slashing swords, spears, and large oval shields, as well as pioneering the use of chainmail armor, later adopted by the Romans too. Some blades and spearheads were even made in wavy or twisted shapes to maximize the damage of a wound, demonstrating both the warlike spirit and ingenious craftsmanship of the Gauls. And then we had other crafts, of course, like pottery. By the 1st century BC, Gallic potters were making wheel-turned, kiln-fired ceramics, sometimes with glossy black or red finishes inspired by Mediterranean ware, and of course textile weaving. Intricate plaids and embroideries on their clothing imply advanced looms and dyeing techniques. The workmanship of their jewelry, finely cast and wrought gold torques, bracelets, and brooches, shows a developed aesthetic sense for the swirling abstract motives that define Tène Celtic art. The Gauls also maintained roads and river routes as trade arteries. Rivers like the Loire, Rhone, Seine, and Rhine were vital for commerce, and of course in later times served the Romans as military highways. Overland, the Gauls traveled by wagon, and noble warriors even used chariots, as Caesar notes in imitation of their British cousins, to fight in earlier times. The use of chariots and heavy wagons implies they maintained passable roads or timber trackways for wheeled transport. In fact, whole tribes could migrate with hundreds of wagons, carrying their people and possessions, as was the case with the Helvetii in 58 BC. Gaul was well integrated into the trade networks of ancient Europe. Trade brought in Italian wine, Roman bronze vessels, Mediterranean luxuries like glassware and coral to Gaul, while the Gauls exported their raw materials, iron, tin, leather, fur, and slaves. By the 2nd century BC, many Gallic tribes even issued their own coins, imitating Greek designs, and that indicates participation in a monetary economy and considerable sophistication in commerce. And so, to conclude this section on daily life, one must note the Gauls' unique attitude toward life and death. They were famously unafraid of the latter, a trait commented on by Romans with a mix of alarm and admiration. Their belief in the immortality of the soul and its rebirth in new bodies made them courageous to the point of recklessness. We are told that at the funerals of their dead, some Gauls would even throw letters onto the funeral pyre, messages to their departed loved ones to be read in the next world. Now, this custom, admittedly touching, illustrates how literally they took the notion of an afterlife. For the Gauls, the boundary between life and death was porous. The next world was a direct continuation of this one, where family and friends would all meet again. Such a worldview underpinned both the daring and ritualism that we've seen in their daily practice. Well, we're going to wheel back a little bit to the Druids in this section. We're mainly going to talk about religion and Gaulish myth, things like this. Well, in general, the religious life of the Gauls was pretty rich, a mix of nature worship, complex rituals, and certainly a pantheon of deities seen through a Celtic lens, and central to it all were the Druids. But if we're going to appreciate their role, we should first outline the gods and sacred practices of Gaul. You see, the Gauls did not record their myths in writings, but Roman observers give us some clues to their deities. Julius Caesar provides a list of the gods that he believed the Gauls worshipped, using Roman equivalents to name them. Foremost among them was Mercury, whom the Gauls revered as the inventor of the arts, a guide for travelers, and a patron of commerce. Now, this Mercury, of course, likely corresponds to the Celtic god Lugus, or a similar deity of skill and eloquence. After Mercury, Caesar says that they honored Mars, Apollo, Jupiter, and Minerva, assigning them functions similar to those of other peoples. Apollo as healer, Minerva as a patroness of crafts, Jupiter as the lord of the sky, Mars as the god of war, and so on. The Gauls, he adds, conceived the gods as essentially the same way as other nations. But we should not take Caesar's Roman interpretation as a complete catalogue. But it shows that the Gauls did have major gods corresponding to pan-Celtic archetypes. A pan-cultural high god of the sky, a war god, a healing god, a crafty and clever god, etc. But they also claimed descent from an underworld god, Dis Pater, a Latin name for Pluto, saying that all Gauls were sons of this dark ancestor. This underworld lineage is one reason why they counted the nights rather than days, as we mentioned briefly earlier. Of course, a century after Caesar, the Roman poet Lucan offered a more sensational account of Gaulish deities. In his epic Pharsalia, Lucan speaks of Teotates, Essus, and Taranes, three Celtic gods he portrays as hungry for human sacrifice. He writes that Teotates was appeased by drowning victims in a big vat, Essus by hanging men from trees and cutting their flesh, and Taranes, the thunder god, by burning people alive in a wicker effigy, comparing this last to the not gentler Taurian Artemis cult of Scythia. Lucan's poetic account is lurid and likely exaggerated for effect, but these names, Teotates, Essus, and Taranes, are genuine Celtic gods, attested in later inscriptions. Taranes, for instance, means thunder, and is depicted symbolically by the wheel, sign of the sun or thunderbolt on many Gallic monuments. Teotates means god of the tribe, and probably refers to a tribal protector, perhaps akin to Caesar's Mars or Mercury. But as for Essus, that's a little bit more obscure. Later commentators associate him with a wild wood god or a form of Mars. Lucan is one of the rare cases where native Gaulish gods are named in classical literature, rather than just being given Roman names, so I suppose that's something unique and special. But beyond the major gods, the Gauls venerated countless local deities tied to particular places. Springs, rivers, groves, mountains. They worshipped the mother goddess figures like Matres or Matrone, usually in triplicate, symbolizing fertility and generative forces of the land. Each region had its own tutelary spirits. For example, the healing spring at Aquae Sulis in Britain was personified as the goddess Sulis, equated with Minerva. In Gaul, a healing god, Granus, was equated with Apollo. The Romans commented on how polytheistic and nature-bound the Celts were. Virtually every natural feature had its deity, and the Gauls were said to worship in forests rather than built-up temples. And that's what leads us to the sacred groves, nemeta, and other open-air sanctuaries. The oak tree was especially sacred. Pliny the Elder describes a remarkable Druidic ritual centered on the oak and mistletoe. On the 5th day of the lunar month, the Druids sought out mistletoe growing on an oak. With great ceremony they would gather beneath the tree and prepare a sacrifice of 2 white bulls. A Druid, clad in white, climbed the oak and cut the mistletoe with a golden sickle. Other Druids caught the sacred plant as it fell in a white cloak spread below. Then they slaughtered the bulls as offerings, praying that the mistletoe would bring divine favor. Certainly the scene that we described in the opening few sentences of the video. Now as for this mistletoe, they in fact called it omnia sanantem, or all healer, was then used to brew remedies believed to cure infertility and serve as an antidote to poisons. This dramatic ceremony, with its emphasis on the oak, possibly the root of the word druid itself, and the revered mistletoe, shows the Gauls' communion with nature in worship, where they saw certain plants, animals, and places as touched directly by the divine. Of course, another core element of Gallic religion was sacrifice, and that includes human sacrifice. Classical writers describe these practices in detail, albeit tinged with a little horror. The Gauls did offer animal victims, cattle, pigs, horses, to their gods regularly, but when circumstances were extraordinary, they also performed human sacrifice. Caesar notes that when gravely ill or facing great danger in battle, the Gauls would make human offerings, believing that a life must be repaid with a life to appease the gods. One method was to construct an immense wickerwork figure, fill it with living men, and then set it on fire. All the victims inside immolated. And this was the famous legend of the Wicker Man. Strabo adds that the Gauls would also stab a human sacrificial victim, and divine the future from the convulsions and blood patterns, or just hang or impale the victims in groves as offerings. Well, they possibly were exaggerating a few of these things for moralizing effect, but they are partly corroborated by archaeology. At Gallic sacred sites like Jaunay-sur-Aronde and Ribemont-sur-Ancre, archaeologists have found pits containing hundreds of warrior skeletons, some showing signs of ritual execution, and thousands of captured weapons ritually broken and buried. It appears that after battles, the Gauls would consecrate the enemy arms and sometimes enemy corpses to the gods, rather than keep them. Caesar himself observed that in many Gallic sanctuaries, heaps of war booty were piled up as offerings, and it was forbidden by religious law to remove them. Anyone who violates that, punished by death. Well, the taboo was so strong that even though, as Diodorus remarks, the Gauls were extremely covetous by nature, they dared not touch the treasures deposited in the temples, and such evidence shows that sacrifice for the Gauls could mean not only killing living beings, but also renouncing valuable goods to honor the gods. But why so grisly with the sacrifices? To the Gauls, these acts may have had a profound logic. They owed the gods the most precious and powerful gifts possible. So by spilling human blood, they perhaps believed they were fueling the forces of life and death that kept the world in balance. It also served as a terrifying demonstration of piety and power, one that certainly impressed and alarmed outsiders. Well, by the way, it should also be noted that by the time of the Roman Empire, these practices had died out, or were actively suppressed by authorities. Over all these facets of religion presided the Druids. Now, we've already discussed their role as moral and legal authorities, but they were also custodians of mythology and ritual knowledge. They memorized and passed down the cosmogonies and genealogies that made the sense of the Gauls' world. Central to Druidic teaching was the concept of the otherworld, a parallel spiritual realm where the souls of the dead reside and the gods dwell. The Gauls believed this other world was not far removed. It could be reached through certain gateways in nature. We're talking caves, lakes, or islands off in the far west. Many of their offerings, especially the casting of valuable objects or weapons into rivers or bogs, were likely meant as gifts to deities in this other world. For instance, they would throw swords, shields, even entire chariots into lakes after a victory, dedicating the spoils to the gods rather than keeping them themselves. In fact, the dozens of swords and chainmail shirts found in the peat of Tène on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, that's a prime example of this practice. But the Druids also practiced divination and prophecy. Besides reading entrails or watching the death throes of sacrificial victims, they interpreted the flights of birds and the patterns of smoke or flames. There were also specialized seers, often called vates, who would foretell the future. These practices gave spiritual sanction to decisions of war and peace. Before major actions, the Druids and vates would determine whether the gods favored success. A dramatic example is recorded in Roman history. AD 60, as the Romans attacked the island of Mona, or Anglesey. That is a Druidic stronghold in Britain, or at least was. They were met with ranks of Druids and women wielding torches, hurling curses. The sight so unnerved the Roman soldiers that they froze momentarily. This story, though occurring in Britannia and a century later, illustrates the fearsome reputation of Druids as masters of dark rites and magic. Well, spoiler alert, the Romans regrouped and mopped the floor with everybody who was there, but hey, it's still an interesting story. Well, finally, the collision of Gaulish religion with Rome had quite a fateful outcome. The Romans, generally tolerant of other people's gods, took exception to Druidism because of its influence in the practice of human sacrifice. Under the early empire, the Druids were first restricted, forbidden to Roman citizens by Augustus, and then they were suppressed outright. Suetonius notes that Emperor Claudius, quote, utterly abolished the frightful and inhuman religion of the Druids in Gaul, which had only been partially prohibited before. By the mid-1st century AD, Druidism had been driven underground, or extinguished in Gaul, though it lingered a bit longer in Celtic Britain. Temples to Roman gods, often fused with Celtic ones, replaced the sacred groves. And over time, the Gallic gods were either forgotten or just assimilated into Roman pantheons. But the echoes remained. Many Gaulish deity names appear in Latin inscriptions from later centuries, and certain folk customs, harvest rituals, winter celebrations, may have had their roots in the old Celtic religion. Of course, that's all good and well, but it all came crashing down with the Roman conquest of Gaul, starting in 58 and ending in 50 BC. It dramatically changed every aspect of the culture. Caesar took advantage of the tribal conflicts and a plea for aid against Germanic invaders, and he intervened in 58 BC. Over the next 8 years, he defeated one Gallic tribe after another, aided by superior Roman tactics and the disunity among the Gauls. But despite fierce resistance, the independent Gaulish nations fell under Roman dominion. Well, they did attempt a final united stand. In 52 BC, the young Arvernian noble Vercingetorix managed to rally many tribes in a grand revolt against Rome. Under his command, the Gauls initially outmaneuvered Caesar with guerrilla tactics and scorched earth strategy. They burned their own towns and deprived the Romans of supplies. But at the decisive siege of Alesia, Caesar's legions encircled them on a fortified hilltop. A huge Gallic relief army gathered and tried to break the Roman lines from the outside, while the besieged Gauls attacked from the inside. In a testament to their valor, the Gauls nearly overwhelmed the Romans. But ultimately, Caesar's fortifications held firm. Starvation and exhaustion set in, and Vercingetorix, hoping to save his people, rode out and surrendered himself to Caesar. This capitulation at Alesia effectively marked the end of Gallic independence. One by one, the remaining tribes submitted, and by 50 BC, Caesar could report confidently that all of Gaul was well and truly under Roman control. In the aftermath, Romanization steadily took hold. The Roman authorities suppressed the Druidic priesthood. Emperor Claudius later formally banned the Druids as practitioners of barbaric superstition. Latin gradually became the language of administration and elite discourse, particularly in the growing Roman cities of Gaul, such as Lugdunum, which is today's Lyon. The Gaulish aristocracy began to adopt Roman dress and customs. They served in the Roman army and even in the imperial government with time. Within a generation or two, some Gallic nobles were granted the ultimate prestige of Romanization. In AD 48, for instance, the Emperor Claudius, himself born in Gaul, admitted Gallic chieftains into the Roman Senate. Traditional tribal territories were reorganized into Roman-style provinces and civitas districts, each governed from a town on the Roman model, equipped with a forum, temples, and basilica. Yet Gaulish culture was never entirely extinguished. Rather, it blended into this new Gallo-Roman identity. Many common folk likely continued speaking the Gaulish language for generations, especially out in those rural areas. The Celtic gods of the land were not forgotten either. They were often identified with Roman gods and worshipped in a syncretic form. For example, a shrine in Gaul might be dedicated to Apollo Belenus, combining the Celtic healing god Belenus with Apollo, or to Jupiter Tyrannus, melding the Gallic thunder god with Jupiter. Thus, old religious ideas persisted beneath a Roman veneer. Artistic styles, too, showed continuity. Celtic motifs like scroll work and animal designs continued to appear in Gallo-Roman metalwork and stone carvings. Over time, the Gauls became fully integrated as Romans. The Edict of Caracalla in AD 212 granted citizenships to virtually all free Gauls, but they also contributed their own flavor to Roman civilization. Thus, by the dawn of the 1st century AD, the culture of ancient Gaul had been profoundly altered, but not completely extinguished. It survived in the fabric of a new society, which eventually laid foundations for the medieval cultures of France and Western Europe. The saga of Gaul shows how resilient a people's traditions can be, adapting even under the yoke of conquest. Thanks to contemporary observers and modern archaeology, we can appreciate the Gauls were far more than mere barbarians. They had a vibrant, sophisticated culture. Their religion, daily life, government, and language left a legacy, one that endured long after the Romans departed. Right, well, thank you very much for joining me. And as is customary, I'm going to thank all of the people supporting the channel, the Patreon, the memberships, all the rest, all those good things. Doug, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn-Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gugu Bubonic. Thank you very much. And that's it for today. Unless you want to go watch another video, I suppose, which you are welcome to do so. It's all up to you. But it's it from me, I'm afraid. Thanks again for listening. Lots of love to you all. And I will see you when you feel like returning. Good night, everyone.